Welcome to our latest webinar from Fairfax Cryobank, expanded panel genetic testing on how to select your donor. Throughout, if you have questions, please enter them into the icon box with a question mark, and we will have a good 30 minutes at the end to answer questions. In addition, there is going to be a recording of this webinar, and it will be shared with all the registered participants by email. And if you know someone who missed it, they'll get it as well. Or if you have to leave early, you will be able to listen to the whole thing at a later time. So let's get started here. I'm Suzanne Seitz. I'm a genetic counselor. I've been with the Cryobank over 20 years. We are joined by Morgan Barker, who is our moderator, and she'll help us with the questions at the end. And then Doreen Bond is our client services manager, and she'll help at Q&A for client services questions. I wanted to introduce you to our genetics team. Besides myself, we have our medical director, Harvey Stern, who is a physician and a PhD and a clinical geneticist. So we have used his expertise in doing all of the application reviews of the donors' medical histories, and he is a superstar when it comes to being a resource for evaluating donors and any issues that come in that are genetics related. The newest member of our team is Shannon Wylock, and she is a genetic counselor with over 25 years of experience, and we are so happy to have her on board. And Nadine is our genetic assistant, and if you are ever going through client services and presenting genetics questions to us, she will be making sure they're triaged very efficiently and are responded to quickly. So the webinar today, our goals are, I want to explain what it means to be a carrier and want to go over the genetic testing that we do on our Fairfax Cryobank donors. Then I want to show you how to use the search to find the donor that works for you. And then of course, we'll have time at the end to answer your questions. Expanded panel testing, expanded genetic carrier testing started here at the Cryobank in January of 2018. So all donors since that time, when they started screening, that was the whatever panel was in place at the time is the test that we did. We started with 283 genes and we're now over 500 genes that we're doing on the donors. It's done by a methodology called gene sequencing, which offers a much higher detection rate than the testing prior to 2018. This is an area of medicine where as each year goes by, the testing does improve. When we get a negative result, it doesn't give us a zero risk, but it does significantly reduce the risk for that donor to be a carrier for that specific gene. When we do an expanded panel test, if any of us goes in right now today and does an expanded panel test, 85% of us, it actually is going to be higher with the more genes that we test for, we'll find out that we're a carrier for a gene, at least one gene. And most of us have never heard of the gene. There's no family history of it in our grandparents or our aunts and uncles. It'll be a surprise to us. And that is the expectation. We are basically all carriers. When we test for a few hundred genes, there's obviously a high chance we're going to find out we're a carrier. But there are 20,000 genes that make up a human being. So the more we test, the closer we're going to get to 100%. And we are all expected to be carriers of something. The important thing, though, is we need to identify those couples where the biological parents are carriers in the same gene. Those are the couples that are going to have an increased risk for a child affected with that condition. And that's going to be a much less number, less than 1%. But if you're both carriers for the same gene, that risk is now 25% or 1 in 4. We can go back to Biology 101 from your high school days. We're talking about autosomal recessive inheritance. So carriers at the top, they have one gene that's a carrier gene. So that gene has a variant in it that's broken that gene. But they have another exact gene that is healthy, does not have that variant in it that causes the gene to break. So carriers have a functioning gene and a non-functioning gene, and they themselves are expected to stay healthy. They will not know they're carriers unless they've had testing done. But if they are carriers in the same gene, 1 in 4 times, the child will inherit the normal gene both times. 2 out of 4 times they'll be a carrier like their biological parents, and 1 out of 4 times they'll actually inherit both broken genes. Now that child does not have the right information in their genes to make whatever protein or product that gene was supposed to make, and that child will be affected with that condition. So we want to reduce our risk. That's our whole goal here. By doing the testing on the donors, on yourselves, is you want to reduce the risk for having a child with one of these genetic conditions. So if you're a carrier for a specific gene, we need to test the donor and make sure he's negative. If a donor is a carrier, same situation. We want to make sure you're tested and negative before proceeding with that donor. That's our quickest way to get to a reduced risk situation. So you want to find a suitable donor. We recommend that you do your expanded carrier testing before you start looking at donors. That's going to give you the largest number of options for donors to choose from. If you have not had expanded panel testing done, you'll see that the majority of our donors are actually carriers for at least one condition. So it's going to limit your choices. You'll have to take an additional step of potentially doing additional testing. And if you've already had your expanded panel testing done and we know what your results are, you can avoid some of those delays by not having to pursue additional testing. And this allows you to get the donor you want before he sells out. If you find a donor you like and you don't purchase his vials, then you proceed with the expanded panel testing, which sometimes can take up to 3 or 4 weeks to get a result. You come back and the donor's sold out. So this allows you more flexibility and a quicker turnaround time to get a donor that you like and be able to use him right away. So I'm going to go over the different scenarios. You're a carrier, you're not a carrier, you've had testing, you haven't, and I'm going to show you ways you can use the donor search to get some donor options. So you are a carrier. Let's say you've had your expanded panel testing done. You know you're a carrier for cystic fibrosis. So you want to look at donors that are already tested, and I'm going to show you a step-by-step process on how to find a donor using our genetic filter. The other situation is you've not had expanded panel testing done. So ideally, you need to pick a donor who is not a known carrier. If he's a carrier for something, then the recommendation will be for you to be tested. But you could pick a donor that is not a known carrier. It's going to limit your choice. Right now, we have almost 500 donors available. You're going to be limited to donors in the 180 donor range, 70 of which who have had expanded panel testing, which is the testing that's recommended. So you're going to limit your pool to about 70 donors, basically, if you have not had expanded panel testing done and you need a donor right away. But if you do find a donor on the list that you like, if you want to look first, you can be tested. And I can show you ways to move that process along so you don't miss out on his vials. I want to explain to you how you can find the genetic testing on his donor page and exactly what testing we're doing on the donors. So when you go to his donor page, you will see genetic testing with a download icon. If you hit that, it will pull up a PDF, and the PDF, you'll see the face sheet of the PDF, but it's typically followed by at least a dozen additional pages of the actual results. And it basically gives you the donor number at the top. It tells you what his ancestry is, whether or not he has Jewish ancestry as well. There was a time, probably a decade ago, where Jewish ancestry indicated a different type of testing than we would do on our non-Jewish donors. Today, all the donors are having exactly the same testing done because all those Jewish conditions, or those conditions that occurred more frequently in that group, are included in the panels. So all the donors are getting the same testing. But I want to go over each of the different types of tests that we do so that you can see what's included. All of our donors have had a chromosome analysis done. And if you remember, there are supposed to be 46 chromosomes. The X and the Y determine the gender of the individual. And we are looking specifically for the right number, but also for any rearrangements. Somebody who appears healthy can have rearranged chromosomal material. They have the right amount, it's just not in the right place. Maybe two chromosomes are stuck together, or there's been a break and a reattachment. Those people are still healthy, but the concern is when they produce egg and sperm, those egg and sperm, which then have to divide their genetic material in half, can make very significant errors, and there's a much greater risk for miscarriage and for poor outcomes. So every donor has had a chromosome analysis, and we determined that it is normal. We also do a hemoglobin electrophoresis. This is a very simple standard test. This was used 30 years ago to look for sickle cell, beta thalassemia, and alpha thalassemia, but it's also a good indicator of overall health. But we're just making sure that there aren't any specific markers there that we would then want to confirm in our DNA testing later on. Now, our expanded panel test, we've used 3 different laboratories. Much of that is dictated by the laboratories themselves as to whether or not they have the test available. We started with a lab called Sema4 with 283 genes. A few years later, they upgraded their panel to 502 genes. Then we moved to Invitae, and we were doing 514 genes. And now we are using Natera and doing 549 genes. Yeah, so you'll see reports from all 3 of those labs when you see a donor with expanded panel testing. Now, what I will tell you is when you're looking at the gene numbers there, like the Invitae 514 and the Natera 549 look like they're testing for almost all the same genes. I will emphasize now that each lab creates their own unique gene list, and there could be many, many discrepant genes. For instance, between Invitae and Natera, there are over 100 genes that are not present on one or the other. So it could be on Invitae, but not on Natera, and vice versa. So by comparing the number of genes you had tested with the number of genes the donor had tested, you cannot make the conclusion that the gene you're looking for has been tested. So it is important for you to very carefully look at your result and know what you're looking for in the donor result. Now, there are physicians at your clinic, genetic counselors at your clinic, or a referral source from your clinic outward that can look at these reports and know much more carefully and whether or not this is a good match for you. We are also available here to help through our genetics team, and you can call client services and get access to our services for us to do a look at your result and compare it to a donor result and see if it's a good match. We specifically look at the gene name as the thing that is the most important. Condition names differ between labs. And so you can have the same gene, but it's called different things. So that's not particularly helpful, where the gene is the common denominator, and that is consistent across labs. These reports are, like I said, over a dozen pages long, and you can really get buried in the weeds. So please reach out to your physician or the genetic counselor through your clinic or us to help you interpret this for you. So to look at the donor search, you can find more information by clicking through on that box with his number in it when you're looking at the initial search results. And if you see this banner, added bonus, this donor has expanded genetic testing, you'll know that he is one of the donors that has had the 283 plus testing completed. If you don't see the banner on the top, then he is a donor that did not have the testing done and is not going to be a carrier. So when you go to the donor search, you have all these options to create your ability to get a list of donors that meet your needs. So you can't possibly look at 472 donors. It would take you weeks and weeks and weeks. So the goal here is for us to help you narrow that list down so that you're only looking at the ones that are really options for you. If you go to the genetic filter, the genetic testing search, if you click on the Any button, then all of the donors will appear. All 470 plus donors will appear. If you ask only for the expanded genetic tested donors, you're going to find the donors that are going to have more than that initial limited testing that we did. And these are the ones that are most likely going to match with you if you've had expanded panel testing done. And then we have donors that tested all negative on the expanded panel. Now, ideally, these are the perfect guys because they're not carriers for anything for which they were tested, and they were tested for a significant number of genes. But if you remember that number I showed you at the beginning, 85% of us are at least carrier for one gene when we are tested. So this is going to be a pretty small group of donors that are all negative. And I will say they sell out incredibly quickly. So if this is the only kind of donor you want, you're going to have to look quickly and act quickly. And this is a good option for someone who has not had any kind of carrier testing done themselves. If you pick a donor with expanded panel all negative and you find someone there you like, then you can move forward right away without having to do your own testing because he's not a carrier for anything. There's no testing indicated for you. Now, this is how you use the filter to find donors that are specifically tested negative for a gene that you are a carrier for. So we give you the option to do it either by the disease tested negative, so the condition name or the disease name, or by the gene name. So you'll see that there will be a name of a condition like Tay-Sachs disease, and then in parentheses it will give you the gene name, HEXA. Cystic fibrosis is CFTR. But a good example of a condition that has multiple names across different laboratories, this phenylalanine hydroxylase deficiency gene PAH is also called PKU, and it can get very confusing if you're only looking to match the exact condition name. But if you look for PAH, that will work out much better for you. The other thing is, an example of one that can be confusing is Zellweger spectrum syndrome. Now, Zellweger, if you just look for Zellweger, you'll find there are like 12 different options because there's a PEX1, a PEX2, a PEX7. So there are multiple genes. They all cause different subtypes of that condition. You will want to match the gene name specifically because if you are a PEX6 carrier, and the donor is a PEX1 carrier, that is still considered a suitable match. So you have to match the gene name exactly. So when you do the drop down, you can do a search query at the top and look for the condition name. You check the box and you hit apply. And on the other side, and this is what I recommend, is you use the gene name and you do that instead of the condition name, and then you will find a list of donors that have been tested and are negative for that specific gene. The good part of the genetic filter is it works in collaboration with all the other filters that we have on the search. So if you prefer donors with a specific ancestry or only adult photos, or you want to make sure they actually have vials available before you get interested in them, or they have a pregnancy reported, there are dozens of options of things that you can choose. You can select those as well. So now you get a very curated list to look at. It is important, though, now that you've checked for donors that are tested negative for what you are a carrier for, we have to remember to do it in reverse as well. So a donor is also likely to be a carrier, and we need to look at his genetic testing summary. Remember, I showed you how to download that from his donor page. And you want to look at that first page and see what's highlighted in red, and that will show you the condition name and the gene name for which he is a carrier. Now you have to do the same thing on your report and see if you have been tested negative. This is where it takes that specialized eye of a genetic counselor or your physician to just make sure that everything looks good before you move forward. So if the donor is a carrier as well for a condition, we just want to confirm that it is not the same condition that you have. And Also, we want to make sure you have been tested and are negative. But if you have not been tested yet, you need to stop. You don't need to immediately buy and ship and use this donor. You can either keep looking or you can decide to be tested. Once you're negative, then you can ship the vials. You do have the option at this point, if you found a donor you liked, even though he's a carrier, to go ahead and purchase him, put those vials in storage with us. Don't ship them. And then pending your results, if you are all clear, if you're negative, then you can ship forward. If it turns out that you're positive for the exact same gene, you have options. We would do an exchange for you. There is a time limit. I'll discuss that with you in a moment. But you do have the option to capture those vials while they're available and put them in a storage account. But any refund or exchange options are voided once those vials ship. So this is something that you need to work out before those vials get to your clinic. If a donor is a carrier, we are going to ask that you download or sign by DocuSign an acknowledgement of carrier status. It has they're pretty standard. They all have the same information on them, except they're customized at the top based on the donor number and the specific conditions that he's a carrier for. But it is important to read through this because we want you to acknowledge that you understand that the donor is a carrier. We'd like you to discuss this with your healthcare provider. And if in bold there, we basically reiterate that if both the egg and the sperm source are carriers for the same condition, now we're in an increased risk situation. That's that 25% risk. And basically, if you're both carriers for the same thing and you have an option to choose a different donor, that's clearly what you should do. We do provide a resource for a genetic counseling network if your doctor's office doesn't have a resource, but again, you are welcome to reach out to us as well. You do have the option to get genetic counseling and testing through your doctor's office if you need to. Now, the refund option is this. So if you sign this, let's say you are ready to purchase, you want those vials put into your storage account, you have a full 45 days after the purchase to leave those vials in storage with us. And if it your testing results indicate you can't use that donor, then you have the option for an exchange for another donor as long as those vials have not shipped. If you end up picking a donor that has a higher cost vial, then you would still be asked to pay the difference. You do need to sign that through a DocuSign document. It can be done very quickly once you decide on the donor that you want. And then client services would need to have that in their inbox when you call and place the order. So let's say there's additional testing requirements. Let's say one of you has not been tested for a specific gene that the other one carries. So on the donor, we can order additional testing. We do have a few genes that we will not test for, so you do need to go ahead and put that in writing exactly what the gene is that we need to test you for or test the donor for. And in order to confirm, we do ask you to include a copy of your expanded panel testing results in an email with the request for a specific donor. The results do take about 3 to 5 weeks. There is an additional fee for testing, and we ask that you own vials before we start the testing because we don't want you to go through all that effort only to find out after 3 to 5 weeks when the results come back negative that donor has sold out. So we want you to keep some vials in storage, and if it turns out that the results are not compatible, but the donor's positive for the same gene you are, then we will give you a full refund on those vials. You just can't ship them. They just need to stay here with us. So you found the donor you want. You're a carrier. The donor's been tested negative for the same gene, and the donor's a carrier. If and when the donor's a carrier, you have been tested negative for the same gene, or both of you are non-carriers. Now we have what we call a suitable match, and these are donors you can move forward with right away. So if you're ready to order vials and you're a new client, everyone needs to complete a terms of use. That is found on our resource page. You can download that. If you have a donor that you like, You can do the terms of use, the acknowledgement of genetic risk if he's a carrier, get those completed, and then you can call client services to place your first order. It's a good idea if you're a first-time client to do that because there are multiple steps in setting up your account, linking that with a specific ship to address for the vials to go to a clinic. So it's really a good idea to get that done through a phone call the first time. You could do online ordering if you're already in the system and this is a new donor for you, but you already have an account. We already know what clinic you're using. Then you can purchase those vials online, and that makes a much simpler process for subsequent purchases. So in summary, we're all carriers. Being a genetic carrier is normal, but we just have to make sure that the partner testing is negative for anything that we're a carrier for and vice versa. And that's the best way for us to reduce the child's risk for those genetic conditions. You can use the donor search, the genetic filter, to look for specific donors tested negative by gene. You can look at his genetic testing results, download those, share those with your physician or your clinic. And then we try and facilitate everything we can to confirm that this is a good match. And once you find the ideal donor, I've given you some steps on what to do next. We do have a promo code available for everyone who's registered for this webinar. FFX Genetics 2025. It allows you the free unlimited access plan till the 15th of June. And that is this unlimited access, if you don't have it already, it does allow you to pay, in this case it's free, but you would pay one price, and it allows you to see all the donor information without having to immediately pay for all of it a la carte. And all of our childhood photos are free, but if you want to listen to the extended interview or see his adult photos, all of those would require additional cost if you didn't have an unlimited access plan. And usually these plans last for several months, and then you can always re-up if you haven't made a final decision yet. So if you have any questions, and if there are any questions, we can get into those. Put those into the icon box there at the top with a little question mark, and we can see if there are any questions.
Hello. We do have one question to start. In genetic testing, I think you do sequence analysis. What is the difference between sequence analysis and gene targeted deletion/duplication analysis? Does it test both?
So the word targeted was in there. When it's targeted, that means I have a very specific variant in a very specific gene, and I simply want to know if it's present or absent. So for instance, in cystic fibrosis, it's a very large gene, and there are over 1,000 different variants that have been identified in that gene. Any one of those variants could break the gene entirely. But if I'm doing a target variant analysis, I'm only looking for one of them. When we do sequencing, it's like reading a book. We're going to read that entire sequence of DNA molecule, DNA ATGB. We're going to look at that whole thing, and we're going to make sure that there's no misspelling anywhere in those 1,000 different variant locations. So sequencing is the complete reading of a gene, looking for any misspelling. Targeting is looking for just a specific one. There really is no need to do target variant analysis. If you have a specific variant in the cystic fibrosis gene, it does not need to match a specific variant in the donor. Any variant in the gene breaks the gene. So it could be variant 10 in you and variant 57 in the donor. You both have a cystic fibrosis variant, you can't use that donor. So targeted testing wouldn't be indicated. The deletion and duplication is something that was added to expanded panel testing probably about 3 to 4 years ago. It's a way to improve detection rates. So you have a couple of ways a gene is broken so that it no longer functions correctly. You can have a variant that's a misspelling that breaks a specific sequence of DNA letters. So that's a point mutation or point variant. You can have a deletion, which means you're actually missing an entire sequence of letters, of segment of that gene. So it's missing, like a word has been dropped from a sentence. So that's a deletion. A duplication is where a word has been put in twice or three times, and that duplication or that deletion changes the ability of that gene to function correctly. So by adding the what we call del-dup or deletion duplication testing onto the sequencing, you're increasing the detection rates. So not all labs do del-dup, but it is becoming more standard of care.
The next one asks, do you recommend a particular company for doing the expanded testing, or should we choose the one of the donor we are interested?
Well, that's actually a really good question. I was telling you that we've moved from one company to another. Semaphore and Invitae are no longer offering expanded panel testing. So in the ideal world, yes, you would have the exact same panel the donor has done. Then we know the genes are exactly the same and everything is as easy as comparing oranges to oranges. I mean, it's wonderful. But unfortunately, in the world of testing today, Natera is the company we are using currently. They have very high quality expanded panel testing. And that's likely the one that you'll be offered. Either that or Fulgent is the other big lab that's offering the screening right now. But usually your clinic will have a laboratory that they work with closely. They may have a contract with them and they may want to exclusively use that lab for all their send out. So important to check with your doctor. This is not a test you can order by yourself. It's a test that you need to have ordered for you through a physician or a healthcare provider that's affiliated with a clinic. So I would suggest going to your doctor and ordering the testing. Now, more is not necessarily better. There are we're testing in the 500 range now, but there are tests on the market that are testing 700 plus. There are some international companies that are testing for over 1,000. And now you're getting into the weeds because if you test positive for one of these exceptionally rare genes, it gets much more complicated to match with the donor because it's very unlikely we'll have a donor that's tested negative for that gene, but then also just coordinating getting that additional testing done. It gets more complicated and costly. So it's good to stay within the same number range, like the Fulgent 487. I think the Natera 601 is what they're offering for the women, or 605. Because for women, you're going to be testing for a panel of X-linked diseases as well as recessive diseases, because things that can be inherited only from the X chromosome, where a woman is a carrier, can pass to 50% of her boys. This doesn't affect the male contribution from the donor, but it does indicate your risk for your future pregnancies. So you'll likely have a panel that includes X-linked diseases where the donors are male, and if they had an X-linked variant, they would have the condition because they only have one X chromosome. So we are not testing our donors for X-linked diseases at this time. But so you're going to want a panel that includes X-linked diseases from the lab that your doctor recommends. Or Natera, we would certainly suggest them. We've been very happy with them.
And someone's wondering, kind of a follow-up question, how much do those roughly cost for them?
So insurance should cover that cost. For you, I think the out-of-pocket cost, if you had no insurance, is in the hundreds of dollars. It's not in the thousands of dollars. 350, 450, something like that. It depends. Your clinic might be able to get you a special rate if they've negotiated a contract with the labs. It's often a benefit in working it out with your doctor. But insurance should cover it. It is pretty much standard of care for someone planning a pregnancy.
And then another question kind of related to this is the expanded paneling, can the physician request it, or does it have to be done by the first infertility facility?
So there are many infertility clinics who are doing IVF that are very insistent that people have this testing done before they start a cycle. So an IVF center is ordering it at a very high percentage on all their patients. It can be ordered through your OBGYN though as well if you're not seeing an infertility specialist. Um, and it probably can even be ordered by your general practitioner, but it does need to be ordered by a physician or a healthcare provider and not, so you can't go online and order it yourself.
Okay. The next one here, if the donor and the mother are not carriers, does that mean the chance of having a Down syndrome genetic mutation is lower, even if the mother is older, in her 40s?
So Down syndrome is something that's a chromosome abnormality that's caused by an extra 21st chromosome. And that, uh, when we look at genes, we're looking at those small beads that sit on those chromosomes, and we're not looking at the whole chromosome structures when we're doing expanded panel testing. So those two tests are not related. It's the chromosome analysis on the donor that tells us that he is not at risk for creating pregnancies with Down syndrome, because we know his 21st chromosomes look fine. They're in the right place. They're not moved around. There's not any of that translocation or rearranged material I was telling you about. Um, Down syndrome, when it happens, typically happens at conception when the egg and the sperm are coming together. And the egg and the sperm have to do a very fine dance where they separate out their chromosomal material as you create a sperm, as you create an egg. At the time of ovulation, your egg needs to divide its chromosome material in half. It puts one into a little polar body and the other stays inside the egg, and that is what's used when the sperm fertilizes the egg. So there is that fine dance that happens. Um, it can happen sporadically in sperm or egg. It's more commonly a sporadic occurrence in the egg because the egg, as it gets older, becomes less efficient at doing that fine dance of separating out the chromosomes. So sperm don't have the same biology as eggs. They're created in the millions all the time, where eggs are in our ovaries at the time we're born and we never make more of them. So they are as old as they were when we were created as a fetus, where sperm are constantly copying themselves. So it is something that occurs more frequently as women age. Um, in that case, if you're doing an insemination, if you would have the blood test that's done in the first trimester looking for indications of an increased risk for Down syndrome. And if those indicators are high, then they would recommend additional testing. If you're doing IVF, then you have the option of looking at those embryos ahead of time by doing chromosome testing on each individual embryo, just to make sure that if there is one with a chromosomal imbalance, that those aren't the ones that you transfer. So those options are there, but the expanded panel testing and the Down syndrome risk are not correlated.
Okay. So the next one here, hello, would the expanded genetics testing be done through yourselves, sent to me / the purchaser in its entirety, i.e. as a full report, or would I only be informed of whether or not I am a carrier of a condition?
So we wouldn't do the testing for you, but whoever did the testing for you would, all of the testing companies have the ability for you to do it through a portal where they give you their um, the entire report, very similar to the reports that we are posting on our donors. So there'll be a front sheet that will highlight what the carrier statuses are. But then the important part of any report, and this is what we need included if you're asking us to help you, is we need all those back pages because we also need to see all the genes you were tested for, even the ones you were negative for. So you will see all of that as well. And all of these laboratories do have genetic counseling services available to review results with you so you understand what it is you're a carrier for and what the medical indications are for partner testing. So they will have resources available, and that's typically included in the price of the testing.
Okay. The next one here says, I have a donor and I like that she likes, but she wants to know if he is a specific carrier for a gene. She doesn't understand what the phenotype will be. How can I get more information?
So you don't understand what that particular disease is and what it means to have a child with that disease. Um, that's what I'm hearing, right,
Correct. And
Morgan?
how does one get more information on it?
On the disease. So the reports actually will give you a summary, a very quick small paragraph about what that disease is. So you do need to keep going. If it gives you this name of a condition you've never heard of before, and I still run across these even having been in this field for 40 years, you've never heard of this condition. The nice thing is the lab reports will give you a paragraph summary of what that condition is, and it will explain whether or not there's a treatment option, um, whether or not how affected the individuals are, meaning do they start in the newborn period? Does it happen in adolescence? And whether or not it, what the symptoms are. Is it vision? Is it kidneys? Is it heart? It'll explain to you what's involved. So that's another good reason to download that genetic testing summary from the donor, because if he's a carrier, you want to familiarize yourself with the disease. But it only matters if you're a carrier for the same thing. If you're not a carrier for the same gene, I wouldn't get too worried about it, because if you're negative, that risk for an affected child has approached zero. It's never zero, ever. We can never get it down to zero, but it is approaching zero. And we would consider that a suitable match if you've tested negative for that gene already.
Okay, so someone here is asking about a reserve program donor who they're waiting for the genetic testing to be done. Um, I think that one, maybe contact client services. I'll follow up with that person. Hold on. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the reserve program is unique, and we do. If you're waiting for your genetic testing results to come back, um, you obviously want to wait for those to be back before you invest in that donor. But there are people in client services that can help you with that.
Yes, that's a new program that we are offering. Those donors do have limited vials, but they are not eligible for being returned.
Right.
And so you do want to make sure that you have all the testing that you want and the review of the donor before you purchase the ID reserves.
So just contact client services and they can help you sort that out because there was a lot more detail in that question. So,
Yeah,
um,
and I mean the whole point of the ID reserve donors is that they have limited families,
right.
and they also have limited vials. So, um, but there is a bigger investment for those donors. So we'll work with you individually on that.
Someone also says the donor I'm looking at is a carrier for something I tested for it and don't have the variant, but on the metabolic disease website, it says this carrier condition. If the child only inherits one copy of the faulty gene, they will be a carrier but will not have the disorders. This is a little worrying, she says. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think I'm hearing that if you inherit the variant, let's say we're a carrier, 50% of the
Mhm.
time we're going to pass that carrier status on to a child. Being a carrier means we stay healthy. It's because we have two genes that control the function of that gene. Even if one is broken, we have the other gene to compensate, and our bodies continue along happily with just one functioning gene. Um, it is so normal to be a carrier. We're all carriers. We believe that we're all carriers for at least a dozen different genes. So this is not an unusual circumstance for us to be a carrier and pass a carrier state on to our child, 50% of our children. So and if you think it long term, well, making, my child has a risk to be a carrier, but then they're going to go on to have children of their own. When they're ready to have children of their own, 20 years from now, let's hope it's not 15, 20 years from now, the testing will be even further advanced, and they will be able to pick up probably the full plate of things that we're carriers for. They'll be testing for thousands of genes. So I don't think we need to worry about a specific gene we identify today as a carrier status in an individual. Now, there are some genes, there are a few genes that if you are a carrier of a specific variant, there's a chance for mild symptoms of the disease. We do have a list of genes that do exclude donors from our program, and we don't, once we get those results, we say, okay, even with the mild status, we're not going to allow you to continue. But every gene has its own story, and so it is important to get into the report and read carefully about what it means to be a carrier, as well as what it means to have 2 copies of the gene and be affected with the condition.
Okay. Next one here, if results are negative for gene sequenced, why is partner testing recommended still before using the donor?
Well, we only need to be concerned about the genes where one of you is positive. So if one of you is cystic fibrosis carrier, the other one should be tested and negative. But if you're both negative for cystic fibrosis, or if one of you is negative for cystic fibrosis, the other one doesn't need to make sure that's tested. You only need to look for the ones that are carrier status, are positive. So if both of you are negative, your risk is as close to 0 as you can get. If one of you is a positive and the other one's negative, that's still a suitable match, because the worst that could happen 99.99% of the time is a carrier child. But if you're both carriers, that's when the red flags go up. But if one of you is negative and the other's positive, that is still considered a suitable match. The only way you would exclude that donor is if you're both positive for the same thing.
Okay. We have a few questions about international clients who want to do this. Someone wants to know, is iGenomics a UK company? Are they based there?
iGenomics is an international company. They have laboratories in the States, they have laboratories in the UK, in Brazil. They have many locations, and they are the go-to lab for our international clients for carrier testing, and they're highly recommended. There is a partnership in the UK where if you work through the iGenomics laboratory and interface with their genetic counselors, they can help you find a suitable match and offer you some promotions as well. So iGenomics works for the international community.
And then what about, we have another client who's in Colombia, Latin America, and wants to know what her options might be.
Well, you do need to start with your doctor's office to see if they've developed a relationship with a carrier testing company. That's the first place to start. If not, ask for a referral to a genetics resource or genetic counseling service in your country, because those genetic counselors could order the testing for you and they would know the lab resources in your country. Some countries, things do need to be shipped out to other places, but we can't order anything, unfortunately, from our end. So you're going to have to find your local resources to get those referrals. But anything that involves a genetic counseling service or your doctor making a referral for you would be the first step.
And I think that was the final question. Thank you all.
All right. Terrific. Just to emphasize, we are going to record. We have recorded this, and we are going to send you a recording to everyone who registered. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to client services. We have our genetics team who answers questions all day long, very similar to the questions you asked today. Our client services team who's on the phones is also very well versed in what the processes are for doing these kinds of matches, and can potentially even help you with the genetic filter in trying to narrow down your list of donors. They're very good at helping people with the pros and cons of each of the donor choices. So don't hesitate to reach out and take advantage of our unlimited access plan if you don't already have one. Thank you, everybody, and we wish you well.